Hey everyone, we are back today. We're going to get started today with glycolysis. So glycolysis, glycolysis. So glyco for glucose and lysis for breakdown. And this pathway occurs in the cytosol of the cell. So there are some props out there that will ask you, where does this occur? And you can say cytoplasm, you can say cytosol, and some of them will say, well, cytoplasm isn't quite right because technically glycolysis only occurs in the cytosol. The difference between the cytosol and the cytoplasm is that the cytoplasm encompasses the organelles of the cell, whereas the cytosol is just the liquid. So there's no organelles encompassed within the cytosol. There's a net equation for glycolysis, and it's something that you just have to memorize, and it's something that you will have questions on all of your exams. And so it is the following: 1 glucose plus 2 ADP plus 2 NAD plus 2 inorganic phosphate, and those go into 2 pyruvate plus 2 ATP plus 2 NADH plus 2 hydrogen ions and 2 water molecules. So the reason that I write it that way is so that you can see that the glucose is becoming pyruvate, ADP is becoming ATP, the NAD is NADH, and then the inorganic phosphate is magically becoming a couple hydrogen ions and some water. Not necessarily true. Not true at all, actually. But that's just kind of one of the ways that I do the bookkeeping in my head to keep track of, okay, this is the net equation. Did I get everything in that equation that I need to have in there? Some professors will have you just write the net equation out and give you points based on that. Others will say, okay, here's part of the equation, fill in the rest. So this is kind of a good way to keep it clear in your head, make sure that you understand where everything's at, and be able to recall it. So we're going to go through glycolysis. There's 10 steps in glycolysis, so there's 10 enzymes. We're going to start with glucose. We're going to go down to glucose 6-phosphate, so it's phosphorylated. And the enzyme that's doing that is called hexokinase. This is step 1. And it's a kinase, and anytime you see a kinase, there's something that's getting phosphorylated. Something is getting that P group stuck on it. So we got, essentially we're talking about part 1 of glycolysis here. And so we've got this investment of ATP going in so that we can phosphorylate these molecules so that we can later gain energy from this whole process. So we got the ATP going in, the ADP going out, and that phosphate group that is getting torn off of that ATP is going straight on the glucose. And the reason for that is we have a number of GLUT receptors or transporters throughout the body, and GLUT just stands for glucose, and T transporter. And so what those do is they bring glucose in from outside the cell into the cell, and if that glucose does not get phosphorylated, there's nothing stopping that glucose from bouncing straight back out that GLUT receptor or transporter. So essentially what the phosphorylation of glucose does is it traps that in the cell so that we can essentially kill it, lyse it, break it down, and utilize it. So from glucose 6-phosphate, we're going to go to fructose 6-phosphate. And we're changing the ring structure here. So the enzyme that we're using is an isomerase. So it's a phosphoglucose isomerase. And some people just say phosphoglucoisomerase. They're synonymous, so you can use it either way. There's no cofactors here, so we're not using ATP or anything else. From fructose 6-phosphate, we're going down to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So this thing is getting phosphorylated again. So now there's a phosphate group on the 1 carbon and the 6 carbon, so that means that we're using what kind of enzyme? That's a kinase, right? So this step here, number 3, big time step, phosphofructokinase, and it's a kinase, right? And it's phosphofructokinase 1. So this tells me that there's a phosphate group that is getting torn off of something and put onto this fructose molecule ring. So we got a ATP that's being invested here and an ADP that's going out, and that phosphate group's getting torn off that ATP and put on that fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. The biggest thing to take away is that phosphofructokinase, this step here is your committed step. This is the committed step in glycolysis, and I can't tell you how many quiz questions, test questions I've had asking me what the committed step in glycolysis is. So if you remember anything, remember that. Actually, remember it all if you can, but that's a big one. So from fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, we got this kind of a different enzyme. Essentially, it chops this fructose 1,6-bisphosphate in half. So we've end up with 2 molecules now, and the name of that enzyme is called aldolase, and that is the 4th step. So aldolase chops fructose 1,6-bisphosphate in half, and that gives us dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And what's kind of cool is that dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are isomers. So these guys go back and forth, depending on the state of the body and how much energy the body needs. So when the body's expending a lot of energy and we're going through glycolysis tenfold or whatever, we are burning a lot of fuel, and so dihydroxyacetone phosphate is being converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, that same amount, tenfold. So this is what that equilibrium equation is going to look like. So we've got this short little guy going that way and the longer guy going towards glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. That just means we've got a lot more production of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and conversion. So now essentially we've got, at this point, because of that conversion, we essentially have 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So from this point on, we're going to have everything going at a 2x rate. So every thing that we're netting out of here, the payoff phase, we're going to have 2 of. So if we get an ATP, we're going to have 2 ATP because we've got 2 times the molecules. So back to the conversion of dihydroxyacetone phosphate to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. That is done by an isomerase molecule because these 2 molecules are isomers. And that enzyme is called triose phosphate isomerase. And then glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate gets converted into 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate by a molecule or an enzyme that will be easy to remember because it comes after glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and it's called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. And triose phosphate isomerase is step 5, and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase is step 6. And the cofactors for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase are the ones that are kind of hard to remember, but they should be easy to remember because they are unique. So we have that NAD plus going in and an inorganic phosphate. And then we have an NADH coming out as well as a hydrogen ion. And remember, these payoffs here in this payoff phase are multiplied by 2. So we have 2 NADH and 2 hydrogen ions. And that'll match up with your net equation up above. So now we move down to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, which is being converted into 3 phosphoglycerate. So notice how that 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is being converted into 3-phosphoglycerate. So one of those phosphate groups is disappearing. So something else is being phosphorylated. So we have a kinase enzyme here that is taking care of us. So phosphoglycerate kinase because something else is being phosphorylated. And we have an ADP that is coming in here and an ATP that is paying out. So here's one of our payouts, right? And then from 3-phosphoglycerate, we go down to 2-phosphoglycerate. And the enzyme there, I think about this in a way that 3-phosphoglycerate, basically that phosphate on the 3 carbon is mutating, and it's just getting yanked over to the 2 carbon. So this is phosphoglycerate mutase. And then there are no cofactors that are present here. From 2-phosphoglycerate, we're moving down to phosphoenol pyruvate. And you make note of that enol there. And the enzyme that we're using is called an enolase. And we are ejecting water here. And again, this is going to be multiplied by 2, so we've got 2 water molecules coming out, which is accounted for in that net equation. And then from phosphoenol pyruvate, we're going down just to pyruvate via pyruvate kinase. And so if there's a kinase here, something's getting phosphorylated again, right? So we've got that ADP coming in and tearing off a phosphate. So we've got an ATP that we're netting there as well, and it's going to be multiplied by 2. So we have 2 ATP netted here and 2 ATP netted here. So 4 total ATP netted or gained. And then we're expending an ATP, so we have 2 net ATP. And that is glycolysis there. So everything you need to know, everything you need to remember, names, enzymes, etc., etc. Let me fill in these numbers here. So we've got step 7, 8, 9, and 10. And so this is a lot of information. It's a lot that goes into glycolysis. It's a lot to remember. And a lot of the time you can get pretty easily tripped up on just trying to spell everything out, and it basically fills a page pretty quickly. So when I was going through this and trying to learn it all, the thing that I did was, okay, I have to shorthand this somehow, and I have to be able to just remember certain things. So the template that I used, I went from starting out with glucose here to glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and then that's where it gets split in half, right? So we turn it into DHAP, which is dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and GAP, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And then DHAP is pretty much always converted to GAP. From GAP, then we're going to the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to 3-phosphoglycerate to 2-phosphoglycerate to phosphoenol pyruvate, and then we end at pyruvate, which is our goal. From here, I said, okay, well now how can I remember the enzymes? And I said, okay, well I'm going to try and shorthand the enzymes now too. So I started off with a hexokinase, and then I went to phosphoglucose isomerase, and then I went to phosphofructokinase 1, which is essentially Big Daddy here, the committed step, the one that we need to remember without a doubt. And then aldolase, which takes us down and splits us into DHAP and GAP. going from DHAP to GAP, we've got triose phosphate isomerase. And then from GAP to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, we have what's called GAP DH, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. From 1,3-BPG, we go down to 3-PG via phosphoglycerate kinase, and then phosphoglycerate mutase comes next to mutate that 3 to the 2. And then from 2-phosphoglycerate to PEP, we have enolase. And then from PEP to pyr, we've got pyruvate kinase. And so looking back through this, I said, okay, now I got to remember all of the cofactors, or the investments, and then the payouts. So hexokinase, there's kinase there at this first step, right? So step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So at step 1 here, we're using that hexokinase, and it's a kinase, which means something's getting phosphorylated, right? So this means I'm putting in this ATP here. So I'm down an ATP. Step 2, there's no cofactors. Step 3, at phosphofructokinase 1, it's another kinase, right? So we're also losing another ATP, or investing another ATP. And then from fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, we're just cleaving it in half. So aldolase does not need a cofactor. DHAP to GAP, it's isomerizing, so we don't need any cofactors there. And then from GAP to bisphosphoglycerate, we are going to need, it's the weird one, right? So we've got NAD plus and inorganic phosphate going in, and then we're netting an NADH and a hydrogen ion. So that's at step 6. Step 7, it's another kinase, phosphoglycerate kinase. So what are we getting out of here? We're getting out an ATP, right? So we're positive in ATP. And then for the phosphoglycerate mutase, nothing going on there because it's just being mutated. For the enolase, that was the water one. So enol, getting rid of that water. So water's coming out. And then pyruvate kinase. So we've got another net of ATP here. And so that's kind of how I shorthanded it. That's how I kind of think of it in my brain as I'm trying to recall certain things and the important steps, and where you're netting ATP, where you're investing ATP, etc., etc. There is one other thing that I did. Some people may find this helpful, some people may not. And if you don't, that's fine. I think this section here has always been my go-to. It's clean. It's easy for me to follow. My brain just works that way. But here we go with that additional method, if you will. So we go from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6 bisphosphate, right? From there, we go to DHAP and GAP. And then from there, GAP goes directly to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to 3-phosphoglycerate to 2-phosphoglycerate to phosphoenol pyruvate to pyruvate. And so that's just the first letter of each molecule in glycolysis. It's a very very black and white, very dry way of going through it. And then from here, I did subscripts and tossed in all of the enzymes. So hexokinase, phosphoglucose isomerase, and I picked the most important part of the enzyme name. So, except for hexokinase, because there's only one hexokinase. So, hexokinase, phosphoglucose isomerase, phosphofructose kinase, and then aldolase. And then from DHAP to GAP, it is triphosphate isomerase, right? So it's another I. And then from GAP to 1,3-BPG, I used DH because that's the only dehydrogenase that we have. From 1,3-BPG to 3-PG, I used kinase, and then mutase, phosphoglycerate mutase, phosphoglycerate kinase, and then enolase, and then pyruvate kinase. So I just used PK there. So this is kind of what helped me, just as I'm doing like a, on my own time, just a quick run through GGFF, DG, BPPPP, or BP4, and then HICA, IDH, KME, PK for the enzymes there. But then you always have to remember what steps in glycolysis have cofactors or are an investment part or are a profit point. So steps 1 and 3 are investments, right? So you put ATP in and you get ADP out. And then up here in step 6, you're putting NAD plus in and inorganic phosphate out in, but you're getting NADH and hydrogen ions out. So 1, 3, 6, 7, and then 9 and 10. So 6 and 7, 6 is the weird one, NAD plus, and then inorganic phosphate gives you NADH and that hydrogen ion. Here we're putting ADP in, tearing off a phosphate to get ATP. And then here at 9, we're getting just water out, right? That's the enolase. And then at 10, we're getting that, netting that ATP again. So that's the payoff. And that is glycolysis, everyone. So please make sure to run through that net equation up here. So make sure you know this. Make sure that you know all of glycolysis. This is your part 1. And then this down here, where we're 2x and everything, is part 2. So part 2 runs all the way down here. Make sure you know those enzymes. Make sure you know the cofactors especially. These are always hot. These are what professors like to ask. And then try and either replicate this guy for shorthand or maybe try this guy down here. But whichever one sticks for you, just keep with it. And it's really about you. So whatever works best for you, keep with it, keep studying it, keep memorizing, and I'll see you in the next video when we go through all these structures. So if you haven't already, hit that sub button. I'm going to get that next video up as soon as I humanly possibly can, and hope to see you there. Appreciate you guys. Take care.